Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. The bottom 10 to 20% of producers are causing 60 to 80% of the environmental impacts of our food systems, but only produce 5% of the food. Today we are joined by Jason Clay, who is focused on creating incentives to get the poorest producers to change. His work with WWF focuses on efforts to engage with the private sector to improve supply chain management, especially addressing habitat, biodiversity, soil health, irrigation, effluent, and greenhouse gases. Jason, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So your work with WWF is on markets and how they influence our food systems. Can you tell us about your approach and why markets are so critical if we actually want to implement changes to the food systems to make it more sustainable?
So I head up the markets work and more recently we've added the food team to that as well. Our markets work was basically based on the proposition that you can drive change through global market actors in places where it's very difficult to get government attention. There are no NGOs to work on issues, etc. But we've always known that even with either work with government or work with companies, the goal is to change the impacts on the ground. That's got to be the ultimate goal, and then the strategies may vary depending on the context. And I think what I've been trying to do is get people to look less about trying to protect what has happened or what we have done in the past or what one region of the world has done, and rather look forward to what's coming and what may be possible with new issues and new contexts and new technologies that we have today we didn't have 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So for me, it's about really not just having a line of sight and trying to roll that out. I think the change is happening so fast and so unpredictably because we don't really know what's causing it always, and we see it too late. But I think it's faster than our strategy and our planning. And so we try to focus on what the goals are that we want and put them into metrics, and then revisit the strategy every 6 to 12 months to see if we're actually achieving it or if we need to try a different strategy. It doesn't sound like much time, but I think fairly quickly whether what you're doing is working, or if it's not working, whether it's not working because you're not the right entity or because it's just not going to work. And then you can either hand it off and get moving on to something else. I think that governments and companies are not at that stage yet. They need to start being much more nimble about how we try things and how we move against things. I'll just give you one really good example, I think, which is kind of scope 3 emissions and how you reduce them in a supply chain. Because for all the major food companies, their biggest impacts, 70, 80, 90% of them are from where and how the food is produced. It's not anything they control, at least even indirectly, really, because it goes through so many different hands. What we found, though, is that when you talk about emissions that way in terms of aggregated emissions, you're talking about averages. And the world is anything but average. In fact, what we found looking at 10 commodities, including beef and chicken and soy and corn and palm oil and coffee and palm oil, et cetera, we're finding that there are 3 to 5 production systems for each globally. With any one of those production systems, the difference between the best decile and the worst decile is 10x. So 10 times the difference. Between any 2 of the 5 production, it can be 50 or 100x. So while I think the average carbon emissions give a company a knowledge of what their footprint is, it gives a country a knowledge of what its footprint is, it doesn't tell them anything about who produced it, why they produced it, how they produced it, and most importantly, what it would take them to change. What's the incentive to get the poorest producers to change? Now, the research shows that the bottom 10 to 20% of producers, in terms of their efficiency and impact, cause 60 to 80% of the 6 or so impacts we care about the most. But they only produce 5% of the food. So if you move the bottom rather than trying to reward the top, you actually fix the problem, or at least live to fight another day. And you can really see continuous improvement. We can never achieve a 60 to 80% absolute reduction without addressing the bottom. We'll never get there by trying to grow ourselves out of the problem.
And by addressing those lower producers, you're not impacting food security. You're not impacting, or you're putting a very the minimal impact on food security and global food production. So you're not going to create greater problems going forward in terms of keeping people fed and all that sort of stuff.
Right, because they're not actually the ones producing that food. And so, and what you do, or at least what we're proposing, is to create a standard for food exports. Not for domestic consumption, but for food exports. And our position is that global trade shouldn't undermine the natural resource base of any exporting country. In the last 40 years, food trade has quadrupled. It's now 30% of total production of food globally. That's equal to 60% of all the food produced on the planet in 1980. That's how fast food trade has actually increased. And food trade is now essential for more than 50 countries. And most of us like food trade because we like coffee or bananas or things that we can't produce in our own countries. So food trade is kind of critical for us. But if we're going to have food trade, then it's got to be either maintaining or building the natural resource base that is producing it. Because future generations with another billion or two people are going to depend on food trade even more than we do today. And with weather variability, with floods and other things, with temperature rises, we're going to see that food value chains are going to get disrupted. So we probably need to take some of that food that's currently wasted and get it into national food banks. But we also need to figure out, can we set minimum performance standards for exports so that companies and governments alike can feel comfortable with buying from people sight unseen? Today, companies buy about 60% of their raw materials from trusted suppliers, from ones that they've worked with for a decade or two or three, and they've got contracts with them for offtake agreements that are multi-year. Those can be used as assets to borrow against, et cetera. So the whole system is set up towards those preferred customers. But if climate change affects their production by 50%, then that company is buying 75% of its product from people it doesn't even know. And so that's where the minimum standards can actually come in and be helpful. And I think that we need to start really shifting our focus from trying to move the rest while protecting the kind of 20th century food system that we have, to figuring out how do we get the worst out of what they're doing, either make them better, help them find a new crop, or help them sell environmental services, which is probably what their land is better for, because the opposite of food production could be nature, could be environmental services. So how do we bring nature back into not just individual farms, but into landscapes? Because we know that even in a microclimate, taking land out of production and getting it back into trees and rivers and other things will actually not just provide better water quality downstream, but also reduce temperatures in farming areas, increase pollination, increase a lot of other services that, first and foremost, the farmers benefit from, and then other people benefit from.
Well, there's all those environmental services that nature provides, it be that the pollinators, the bird species, which then, pest reduction. There's so many things that don't come onto the...
And microclimate, which is going to become increasingly important with temperature rises. I mean, it's not just for people, it's also all the livestock that's produced. Mammals don't do well over 70 degrees. Yeah. And so we're getting to a world that's well beyond 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not talking about Celsius here.
No, no, no. That would be even beyond what you get in the Middle East.
Exactly.
But no, 70, that's which is what that's about 20, 25, mid-20s in terms of Celsius.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love what you're saying, and I love the approach and the fact that you are looking at building trust and working with trusted partners. And but the big question that comes is that's a huge job. And where do you start? How do you actually turn that from, a policy or a theory that you're working on to getting real action in this space?
So I think the way we're kind of starting is with a few kind of basic principles. One is that if you want change to happen at a scale and a speed that's required, it's never going to come from NGOs. And yet NGOs can leverage change. And so the question is, how do you do it? I think it's good ideas, well documented, ideally already being implemented by commercial sectors and by governments around the world so that the information is more trusted by others. For example, just to give a clear one, there's a lot of work being done on how to get traceability back to cow-calf operations in Brazil to show that the animals are not connected to deforestation. The best work on this has been done by an NGO, and I think some fairly large double-digit number, 10, 20% of the herd is already potential Brazilian herd could be done through this system, or at least of traded animals outside of the country. But China won't accept it because it was developed by an NGO. And it's not just China. Many countries have problems with NGOs, even Scandinavians. I remember when we were doing seafood standards, they were not interested, not happy with it, because they saw that as the role of government, not the role of NGOs, especially a few self-appointed individuals within NGOs who weren't anymore they weren't as representative of society as government were, and they certainly weren't elected.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what is the role of NGOs? And I think it's to understand the problem enough to be able to suggest potential solutions. They're not all going to work. And I think we have to realize that good ideas don't always land, or they're not always at the right time. Like things I've suggested, like I started using an environmental premium on food exports 35 years ago when I set up a trading company in Brazil, and I charged the companies that were buying Brazil nuts and oils and fruits and things from me 5%, and I gave 100% of that back to the communities I bought from as a kind of profit sharing. And then we started with profit sharing as well. I don't think we can go that far. We can't go 5% and we can't require profit sharing, but I think we can get a 1% on the FOB price, on the free on board or the CIF price on landed. That's significant money for 5 Brazilian commodities. 1% just on the exports for soy, beef, hides, cotton, and corn. That's about $750 million a year, because it's collected on all the exports, and then you focus it on the 5 to 10% of producers that need to fix a problem and make it a grant as long as they fix the problem. Because the 1% is really a way to get consumers to pay the actual cost of production. We're trying to use this 1% to correct the environmental externalities that have been created by production that didn't cover those costs. And so by doing this, we can begin to make those commodities more sustainable and at the same time more resilient. So they'll be there for producing exports for those countries and others to buy in the future.
So the 1%, there's obviously a balance between what the market is willing to pay and what the true cost of those externalities are. And as you said before, this is an ever-changing space. So you start somewhere and you migrate it as need be. Is that 1% sufficient to cover those externalities, or is at that level then nature is still largely subsidizing our modern food systems? And if you've actually done the work on this, what would be the true cost of of nature's input?
So there's a lot of people that have done that work, but that's kind of like how many angels are in the head of a pin. To me, that's not terribly useful. And I would just push back a little bit in the sense that I think modern food systems have had a visible impact on nature. I think previous food systems often had a much bigger impact where they were. It's just that there weren't as many people then. Now we've got a lot more people. And now we've got people who are dedicated farmers to producing surpluses for cities and for others. And I think that we can never go back to those other systems because we can't do slash and burn. And besides, if you look at the impacts from that, they're not exactly small if you just think about the name and what it means and whatnot. But I do think we've got to, we need to play the deck with the hand we've got and figure out how to make it better. And that's a constantly changing thing. I do think that we need to try to focus on data and take as much subjectivity out of this as we can. And in that regard, we need to have common tools and common definitions and common parameters. Right now, Europe has 15 or 20 LCAs that are being done by different people and come up with different results. The closest are probably 1x apart, so 100% different. We've got apples to oranges comparisons going on. We've mostly got fruit salad because there are just so many things. And if you think about what people who are trying to do the right thing do in that kind of a context, that's one thing. But if you think of the people who are trying to avoid doing the thing that's going to cost them the most, then it's like being in heaven. And we know that companies have done 6 or 7 LCAs, and they take the one that shows they have the least responsibility, and they can postpone it until any action until 2030, and they use that to go with. So until we have common tools, that's going to be critical that we be transparent about how calculations are made so that we can get back at them. Codex Planetarius is about creating not just a common methodology, but then also setting a metric performance for that impact. So there's 6 impacts that'll be measured. Most of the scientists that I know hate it as a concept because they think you've got to measure 3 or 4 things. And I keep saying, if anything to measure is going to cost $1 billion and you multiply it by 6 just for one impact, how are you going to measure all 6 impacts? And so we don't need to be perfect here. What we're trying to do with these 6 impacts is not to make them the performance sustainable, but to make it less bad. If this is where 60 to 80% of the impacts are, and we can move through trade that and cut it in half, then we've already reduced by 30 to 40% the global impacts, and we're halfway there. So that's a good start. We need to do that, but then using the same indicators, setting the performance at different levels for different geographies, different crops, that makes a lot of sense. It also gives a pathway to people of continuous improvement. They at least know what's better, they know how people have achieved it, and they're measuring things the same way so they know how they compare to it. And if the UK or Europe or the US want to hold their equals to higher standards, great. But developing countries may get a break the same way they did with the WTO to come into compliance. That's fine. Turns out, if you look at trade, 75 to 90% of the top 20 commodities, food commodities being traded, come from 15 countries. So, and those 15 countries, none of them are what you would call developing countries. I mean, it includes Brazil and Argentina and Indonesia, but there's not a single country in Africa that's on that list. And so I think this system would allow for the countries that are now the biggest suppliers of food products globally to understand and begin to measure their performance and see how to move it forward. The thing that I found out, and I've been working on standards for 25 years or so, way back even 35 years ago when I was doing all the work in the rainforest, we had to figure out how to develop kind of performance levels that we could evaluate. And we were focused on income and other kinds of things. But increasingly on the environmental side, it's clear that standards are important to, if we want to make real gains, because what we're seeing now, I mean, scope 3 is a good example. People are talking about regenerative ag. And so the first thing that comes out are these practices you have to adopt. And the government's required practices. Practices are a means, they're not an end. If you give 1,000 farmers the same practice, you'll get 1,000 results. And it depends a lot on how the practice is applied, the soil, the crop, the rainfall patterns in that area, everything. So if you want a result, ask for it and measure it and require reporting, because a practice-based system at best gets you a percentage of compliance. But a results-based system inevitably finds some joker that can triple the efficiency. And then suddenly you can raise the bar. So what's the deal here? Well, a performance-based thing lets farmers and producers do whatever they can do best to change that number. And some of them are going to find a way to do something totally different than anybody's thought about. And so performance actually encourages innovation, whereas practices encourage compliance, which is going to get us through climate change. We need innovation. We need constant improvement. I would say we should just say continuous and constant improvement. I mean, because that's what is going to allow us to be not sustainable. I would argue that nothing is sustainable, because when you use resources, it has an impact. But some things are acceptable. And so the question isn't for me how to define sustainable. It's what is more sustainable than what was there, and how do you measure it? And then what is making a system more resilient? That's really where we need to go. What allows systems to bounce back after shocks? I remember seeing some of the very early photos before and after Hurricane Mitch in Central America, and it showed that where there were perennial grasses planted as borders on fields, there was a lot less crop damage, and there was a lot less soil erosion, and so the farmers could go back to production immediately. Whereas with the ones that weren't, they were just gullies. I mean, they'd been washed out entirely. And so though some systems are more resilient than others, and we need to figure out how to capture that in metrics.
So much you've said there, that not quite sure where to take that next. Back to what you're saying about the compliance versus innovation, I guess. And it reminds me of when I was in the Middle East, and you looked at the way that Saudi subsidized their livestock production compared to the way that the United Arab Emirates subsidized theirs. And Saudi subsidized the actual production of food. So you had a lot of, poultry farms, dairies, et cetera, popping up because the subsidy was on the final product. The UAE subsidized the actual feed. They subsidized the input. So you had a lot of people feeding a lot of animals, but those animals weren't particularly growing terribly fast because the incentive was to use the feed, not to actually grow food. So getting those balances right can have a really big impact in the longer term, in terms of both how much food you're producing, but also the environmental footprint of that. You mentioned there were 6 things or metrics that were the focus. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what you said, because I think and then I'm happy to talk about that. But one of the things that I think is really important is that in a world of change, and farmers don't like change, and yet the crops they grow are going to be changing by years and certainly by decades, not by lifetimes or careers. And so I think we need to provide those that are in the middle of this up to their necks. They all want to just be told what to do, what's going to make it right. That's not going to work, because nobody knows what to do. The question is, how do you think about what to do? How do you think about things that you're seeing? Who do you talk to find out more information? Because people can only own so much data themselves. How do you get access to it? How do you do it through people or networks or computers or platforms? Those are things that we haven't really begun to talk about. But I think we need farmers to start thinking again, not just sitting on machinery. They've got to be thinking about what it is they can do in 1,000 different ways that makes them more resilient. That's what a more resilient food system depends on. So back to your question, what are the key impacts? So it's curious. They're kind of obvious. I'll state what they are, and then we'll go through kind of what some of the implications are. One is about habitat. One is about biodiversity. One is about soil health. One is about water take for irrigation, and one is about water effluent, so runoff, and one is about greenhouse gases. There are other things that could be looked at depending on the type of production or the specific location of production. Pesticides might be one, chemical fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers might be another one, but they're not always an issue. Those are always issues that need to be looked at.
In what you said about the getting farmers to think, you can tell from my accent that I didn't grow up in the US, but it reminds me somewhat of I'm going to throw in a rugby analogy. I don't know how well that's going to go down with everyone, but when in the game of rugby, when you tackle someone, the game keeps on going. So basically, as soon as you tackle someone, you're jumping back up, ready for the next wave. Rather than if you look at something more like American football, where you tackle someone, that's the end of the play, and then you get to reset. And
well, baseball's even worse because it's every pitch.
But it's that whole concept of you're not concentrated on just getting that tackle in or whatever that is. You're concentrating on, okay, what's that next step? What's going to come out next? And it's a change in the way that people are thinking. So what's needed to start that or to evolve or accelerate that process?
I think crises help. I remember I grew up on a farm, and it was a tiny farm. We lived on less than $1 a day. My father was killed in an accident. I had to kind of help run the farm after that, and it ceased to be a great place to grow up and became a place that you never wanted to be responsible for. But what I ultimately came to see was that you learn a lot about decision making and how to make decisions real time on farms, because you have to make decisions right away. You never have money to solve a problem. I mean, that's never the first choice of most farmers that I ever knew. It's kind of the last choice because you protect that with your life. But you keep piles of old machinery so you can borrow a bolt or a nut or a piece of iron you can weld onto something else. And same with lumber and all this stuff. I think that we've kind of lost that, and people are not solving those problems by thinking about them. They're letting machineries do most of the thinking, and now we have thinking machines. So you don't even have to drive them. You just have to make sure the machines don't kind of screw up. But we need to get back to farmers having real clues and indicators about what's going on around them, not just at a yearly basis, but much more quickly than that. And I think we have some opportunities in that regard. So I'm gonna pivot here to one of the ways I think we need to start thinking differently. The farms of today are actually kind of stranded assets. They're going to have to change and be repurposed for use in the rest of the 21st century, et cetera. How do we do that? I think one of the ways we start is with older farmers. They're the lowest hanging fruit here. For a generation or more around the world, kids on farms have seen that the future is not on the farm. It's anywhere else. And so the average farmer is 54 years old globally. The average rancher is about 10 years older. For farmers, their children now have children, and they made a career decision a long time ago for the most part. So they're not going to become the farmers, or at least, 4 out of the 5 kids or 6 out of the 7 aren't going to be farmers. There's one that's designated maybe. So there's at least, I would say, so half of the farmers are over 54, and of that half of them, or a quarter of all farms, don't have a succession plan. So what if, because those farmers are older, making some assumptions here, many of them, I would say probably most of those older farmers, if you look at this globally with small farmers, they haven't really invested in the future. They haven't had the money to transition their farms to be more productive, to buy the machinery, buy the technology, buy the inputs, etc. They are waiting out the farm. And this is for them to live on, for them to die on, probably, etc. So, can we take that 25% that doesn't have heirs and offer them a way to make a living off of another type of product like environmental services? A lot of the land they could afford, their families could continue to own over time, was marginal land. It was land maybe that should never have been farmed. It could be turned back to nature, improve water quality, improve stream flow year round. It could reduce soil erosion considerably. This has got to have some value to downstream water users. Um, it could actually become biodiversity corridors. It could become habitat. It could become pollinators for a larger area that could benefit from it. Is there a way that these environmental services could start to be linked to the commodities that are being sold so that you both have carbon and commodities? Because one of the things that this land could be used for is sequestering carbon, whether it's wetlands, whether it's grasslands, or whether it's timberlands. Uh, and I think we just have to think differently about what the crops of the 21st century might look like. The thing that is, you're from Australia, so you probably get this example. Um, if you know anything about sugar, Brazil's sugar industry 50 years ago sold sugar. And then somebody had the bright idea that you could start running cars on 1% of ethanol. And so Brazil sugarcanes pivoted to ethanol. Well, about 20 years ago, most sugar companies had also pivoted to burning bagasse, the residue after you squeeze the sugar cane, burning it instead of feeding it to livestock, burning it and making energy. And so it's a kind of green energy. And now they have a lot of the sugar farms have about a third, a third, a third of income from those different sources. Dairy farms are now doing the same thing with biogas digesters. They're making as much money off the manure, turning it into renewable natural gas, into electricity, and then capturing the liquid ammonia and NP and K from the substrates. So they're not running it just to produce dairy, they're producing it as an integrated operation. Ranchers in the west of the US, on an average year, they make about 75% of their money from selling beef. But in a bad year, they make 50% of their money selling hunting rights. And even on a good year, they make 25%. So they're managing the land for birds, but we're not talking about antelope and bison and elk and stuff. We're talking about doves and quail and things like that. And this is how they are, or they're doing ecotourism and camping for the summer and stuff. We just need to get some of these landowners to start thinking a little bit differently about their operations and maybe get governments to pivot subsidies away from supporting 20th century crops and start supporting the farmers that are trying to innovate for the 21st century. I would rather subsidize a person who is prepared to fail than somebody who's simply doing the same thing over and over again.
I think the role of governments here and the role of subsidies, because it goes back a bit back to what I mentioned in the Middle East, but that's by far not the only example of that, and having those price signals, and not just, I guess, the price signals, because there's also the all the other bits and pieces that you need to
insurance and everything.
Do you need to have a separate business license to have camping on your property? Do you need extra staff for whatever those things are? Can you get those staff, or you need to get visas for them? Kind of streamlining all that whole, I guess, incentive package. So how, you mentioned that there was a handful of countries that are the major exports of food. So that's a handful of different governments you have to deal with their own bureaucracies and their own internal processes and challenges. How do you go about that process of initiating those conversations with those governments
Right.
and trying to get that, I guess, that foundation where the change will happen more easily?
I think, the odd thing is, I think it's pointing out the obvious. I think people know things that they have no idea about how to act on. So if you can point out the obvious and also then provide a couple of different alternatives, that it can help people make a decision about what to do. But again, it's about how to think, not you should do this or you should do that. But if you take the obvious, in the US, we took we paid farmers to stop growing land on highly erodible, floodable, and marginal lands. And it was, we got a great return on that payment. I think we took 8% of land out of production in the US, out of all the farmland in the US, and we reduced soil erosion for the whole country by 50% because they were the outsized eroders, if you will. Um, and and that cost, if we didn't allow them to grow trees or things that could actually sequester carbon, if we had and allowed them to sell that carbon, they would have made more than they would have made growing row crops. And this is where it starts getting interesting to document some of these kinds of things. What if we know that we're not going to be producing the same crops in 10 or 20 years because of rainfall and heat? What are we doing to help that change? Subsidizing insurance programs or commodity prices for people who are producing last century's crop is not the way to get there.
That'll just lock in current practices.
That just locks it until it does a nosedive into disaster. But could we pivot at least some of those payments and things to people who are trying to develop and understand the next crop? Because I'd far rather ensure failure of the next crop than to pay for an insurance policy on a crop that had never been grown there, getting paid average production, for that area, which is how the U.S. system, where every country is a bit different. But we need to start using whatever tools we have to anticipate change, not to try to keep the past together. As my youngest son recently told me, and many times before the election and certainly after in the US, it's never going to go back to what it was. Forget about it. You boomers don't get it. And I think our food system is the same way.
Yeah.
That said, it's not going to change the way a lot of people who are commenting on it would like it to change either. I do not see, I think the culture of eating animal protein is in the brain, and it goes way back, and it's certainly reinforced by all the people that have money around people who don't and have had for millennia. So if I look at I'm an anthropologist by training as well as a farmer. So if you look at this culturally, the first generation that comes into money always spends it on more animal protein. And it's more divisible than a motorcycle or a car or a house. You can take and splurge on a meal, and you can do something you've never been able to afford to do. Maybe even not just a meal of protein, but in a nice restaurant, so that you feel good about it. It's reinforcing. The culture has reinforced that for generations. The second generation was actually fed more animal protein because the parents could afford it after they got out of poverty. And the second generation is going to be more carnivorous, if you will, than even the first generation out of poverty, because they don't have the culture of eating, other things, and they have more money. And so it's also linked to wealth. It's the third generation that finally can see the world for what it is and decide themselves what they want to do. And you'll get some people in the second generation who do this too, but generally it's the third generation says, that's just not healthy. I don't want to eat that. That's not good for the planet. I don't want to do that so much. And they will begin to do this. So 3 generations is not quite by 2030. much less even 2050. It's a longer term process, I think. China brought 400 million people above the poverty line between 2007 2015. It maybe pulled another 200 million globally as well. But in those 400 million people, look at what impact that had on animal proteins and on feed grains. Just went through the roof. It took them 12 years to double their GDP, and within 12 years of that, so that happened in 97, they doubled it, and by 2027 or so, or 2007 is when they really began to take off. India took 17 years to double its per capita income, GDP, and they have just reached that 17-year period in 22. So in the next 17 years, India will be by far the largest global economy. By 2047, the expectation is that there'll be 600 million Indian what are called middle income Indians, about 500 million, 400 million that are upper income, and less than 10% that are below the poverty line. When you bring
they're all that first generation, back to what you're saying. So
and when you bring that many people into a system, now I don't think there is a culture in India to eat animal proteins at the same level it was in China. That's why the pork production just went crazy, and then poultry, and then beef and seafood, everything in China went crazy. But that was only 400 million people. In India, we're talking somewhere on the order of 1 billion people above the poverty line between now and 2050.
So we need solutions for livestock because livestock are not going away. Is that?
They're not going away, and I think we need to make sure that we get rid of the worst producers. Like if you look at poultry globally, if most of the poultry was produced in mom and pop operations with just running around in gardens or even fenced in areas, we'd have a lot less efficient production. Today, about I think the figure is 60+ % of poultry is produced in the same kind of structure, the same kind of business model and production model. But about 5% of global poultry is produced in very extensive, and in this regard, 20% of Indians' poultry is produced that way. So if India can just get its poultry system in closer to the norm of the global production system in terms of efficiency, doesn't mean you can't deal with animal welfare issues. It just means that you don't have a lot of running around in yards getting killed or eaten by something else, or low feed conversion ratios, et cetera, or feeding just table scraps rather than other things that could be used. Even composting, or not composting, but compressing table scraps into food for poultry is fine. I mean, but in general, it's just not a very productive system. The same is true with poultry, pork, egg production as well. What's great about those systems is that increasingly, 60 to 80% of the production of those three systems is all the same. And so there, you don't have to figure out how to improve every single country. You can take the production system and create platforms for those people to start sharing information with each other. We did this with global salmon, with salmon producers in Norway and Iceland and Faroes and New Zealand, Australia, Chile, British Columbia. And what we found is that about 17 companies at first, I think it's 15 now, joined together and shared all their data about production. Because for two reasons, they knew that the reputation of the whole sector was only as good as the worst actor. And so they needed to raise the worst actor. But they also knew that they all knew something that the other people didn't know. And so each of the companies shared data, and within 10 years, they were certified as sustainable against global credible standards. But they have continued to work on reducing fish meal use, reducing fish oil use, on reducing by 90% chemical treatment of sea lice, because they found ways to combine things, almost like pesticide rotations, where you don't You don't create resistance because you don't use just the same thing over and over again. They're doing that with antibiotic use, etc. The same kind of results. They're using single vaccinations of fish in Norway to reduce the use of antibiotics. But now they've decided to work together to take the big sources of greenhouse gas emissions out of the feed, because it turns out that at the farm gate, feed is 60% of the emissions of salmon. And if they've started using soy now as a substitute protein, if soy is 15 to 20% of the feed, then it doubles, and it's from Brazil and it isn't deforestation free, then it doubles the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the fish from 60 to 120%. And so they've started telling their feed companies, we don't want soy from Brazil unless you can guarantee that it's not this or that or another thing. And so that gets those companies to move. This has launched a whole ESG screen for feed ingredients that can reduce not just the greenhouse gas emissions, but also labor issues and other kinds of slave labor, child labor issues, et cetera, in some of those feed ingredients. But I think that the issue here is that pre-competitive approaches are ways that sectors can actually work together, because they're competitive when it comes to how they position themselves and which markets they sell in, et cetera. There's overlap. But from the point of view of sustainability, they're all doing the same thing and all depending on the same kind of resources. And they're all going to be, held up to the same standard. Or accused of the same thing unless they move the bottom. The bigger issue, though, is that the better salmon producers found that the worst salmon producers had actually figured out how to do some things that they hadn't. So everybody actually learned from each other. And that reinforced the need to do this. So can we get poultry and pork and eggs doing this? That's the next three that are the closest in terms of production models. And then let's look at shrimp and dairy. Things like goats and sheep and beef cows, those are going to be the hardest ones. But taking the biggest impacts of them actually has huge impacts on government on emissions. Brazil and China are negotiating some things about beef, and one of the requirements of Brazil is that, or excuse me, of China, is that they don't buy any animals that are over 30 months, because the amount of emissions an animal makes are based directly on how long it lives. As long as it's eating it,
the growth rate and the fastest growing, got you're diluting emissions by growing it faster.
Right. And so, or even you're getting less emissions per kilo by when you buy it. It may be a smaller animal that you're buying, but it's less carbon in it. Now that's going to force Brazil to move on efficiency, because right now Brazil, in parts of like the Amazon and the Cerrado, it's 3 or 4 years even for a calf to get to market. So 30 months is 2.5 years. In the U.S., it's less than 2 years, often really less than a year and a half, or right around a year and a half. But it's in that time frame. But in Brazil, they only have animals nurse longer, and so therefore cows only calve every other year. So 50% of cows are actually giving birth. In the U.S., that's in the 90s, 90%.
Obviously, those cows that aren't productive,
so they're just producing more methane. Yeah, and so all these things contribute to this issue. So efficiency does let us really reduce some of the biggest impacts of these animals. Of course, if the choice is not to eat them, yes, then that would reduce that too. But as we're looking at the impacts of cereal grain, rice and wheat are right up there in terms of emissions with beef and soy. They're not as, beef and pork. They're not as big as either of those are, but in total, they're bigger than poultry. And so that's where you start seeing some differences here. Anyway.
So it's wonderful to hear that the likes of China, which is a huge importer and has a lot of market power, are driving, that market, I guess, those market demands from the likes of Brazil. Are there any big players that are laggards, I guess, in terms of driving demand, that where more, I guess, advocacy is all you can do is needed.
Well, of course, I'd put U.S. at the top of the list, both on the production side and certainly on the consumption side. I mean, when you have climate change not even being really mentioned in a presidential election, it shows kind of where the U.S. is in this whole thing. But it's the U.S. is clearly a easy to target in this regard, but my sense is it's probably a lot more consistent with global actions of other governments and companies. I think there's a lot of interest on the part of some governments and some companies too, but they're a fraction of the total number of companies and governments that need to be working on this. And I think that as long as the U.S. is not doing anything, as long as it's not taking a positive leadership role in this, it's definitely a drag. But there are a lot of people that want to be drugged. if you catch my drift here, I think everybody's waiting for the other person to act. And what I'm seeing that's beginning to get me even more worried than I normally am is that when there's a drag, people not only just don't do what they could be doing, they actually do more of what they shouldn't be doing because they want to do as much as they can to get as much profit as they can so that when they have to do something, they'll have at least a little bit more money in the bank. Or whatever the rationale is. If everybody else is going to do it, they're going to do it too, kind of thing. And that drives us to the bottom, race to the bottom.
There was a situation or some legislation came through in, I think it was in Queensland in Australia a couple of decades ago. I can't remember exact timing, where they announced that in X number of months, they're going to put much greater restrictions on the clearing of forest on grazing properties.
And it spurred deforestation.
Led to a huge acceleration. It's like we need to get in and do as much as we can while we're still allowed. So once again, it comes through those signals that governments put out there.
There's just before we get totally off this, but on the greenhouse gas emissions on scope 3 and how do we reduce, the major issues, it's understandable but regrettable that the attention for so long focused on energy and transportation. And I say it's understandable because those were very clear targets and they were very clear actors and the sources of both the numbers of companies involved and what they needed to do was relatively small. But I'm why it's uncomfortable or unfortunate as far as I'm concerned is that the food system is actually a biological system, and neither of those are. And they are very easy to fix by comparison. I mean, there are how many power companies around the world? 2,000? There are that many sugar mills in India. So how we need the same, we need a lot more focus, but a lot more different kinds of knowledge coming to be brought to bear to all the different circumstances where food is being produced and different crops are being produced in different geographies with different climates, et cetera, because the impacts are different. We know that food production has about I would say a third of the greenhouse gas emissions. That's as much as anything else, probably, and it's more probably than either electricity or transport by themselves. In fact, a lot of the electricity and transport is linked to food, if you stop and think about it that way. But actually, the bigger issue is, I think that we have to have food and we can't cut it back beyond certain levels. And to produce it, we're not at the point where we can really grow our food in closed systems and without soil. And so it's going to be susceptible to variable weather, to floods and droughts. It's going to be susceptible to temperature increases. All of those things are going to make it harder to produce food much less produce food with fewer impacts. And I think a lot of what I see is maybe well-meaning in some ways, depending on, based on the person's values, et cetera, to reduce commercial production, to reduce livestock production, et cetera. I think a lot of that doesn't really take into account a lot of markets and where markets are headed. And it also doesn't take into account that that less efficient food systems produce many times the impacts per unit of output. And the issue about these targets that we've got globally, let's just take greenhouse gas emissions, although Codex is interested in more than just that, because greenhouse gas isn't the only or even the best indicator of food production sustainability. But it is one that we all have to work towards. We need to be thinking about that in very different ways in terms of how to achieve that. And I just think that by getting rid of 60 to 80% of the impacts in absolute terms that we're talking about now is the best way to start doing that, rather than start trying to take certain foods off the shelf per se, because that's a battle royale with consumers and with countries. I mean, I would even say, should we start thinking about, if we really have to manage the planet, should we start thinking of production and distribution systems that take advantage of comparative advantage and stop trying to focus on food self-sufficiency, and really look at how do we make sure that we can provide food for all and not waste any of it, or at least waste a very small amount of it.
And very much, there are certain geographies or locations that are much more efficient at producing and produce.
But they don't need to be eating it all either.
No, completely.
So I think we could do some good work both ways on that one.
Most definitely. We're basically running out of time. There's been so much really, really interesting stuff that you've shared with us. So thank you very much for that. We talked about the laggards slightly a few minutes ago. Is there anyone or companies, countries that's showing real leadership in this space that you think should be, or organizations, NGOs that you should think should be highlighted?
The short answer is no. I mean, I think it's a different way of thinking about the problem. For NGOs, it's very hard to work with the laggards because you don't want to subsidize them, but you also don't want to take money from them. And so you're kind of in a catch-22. You can't just do this for free. Somebody's got to pay for it. But right now, there's nobody that's willing to actually focus on the laggards. We're just now beginning to see some movement with the IFC and some others in developing countries about moving the bottom as being something that they might want to get involved with. I think what we need to do to be in the position that you have described as who's willing to work with the laggards is, every company has laggards in their supply chain. The problem is commodities over the last 150 years have basically, I don't know, there's this saying in the US about universities, University of Chicago is the place fun goes to die, because people work so much when they're there. I think commodities are where crops go to lose all data about who they are. And so it happens within the first mile of production. And everything after that, everything is homogenized. It's all mixed together. 1 ton equals 1 ton. But you have no traceability, no transparency. You don't know things. And so the downstream buyers don't know this stuff. The traders do tend to know it. They buy directly, but they also buy through aggregators. But at least they have the closest line of sight on this. But how do you keep this information separate? And how do you decide that if traders were moving towards a more traceable and transparent system, how would they help to improve those bad performers as a requirement of selling to them? So if we start with something where 70% is good and 30% has some problems with it, would you give them 5 years to get to 75%? Would you give them 10 years to get to 80%? And then at the end of the day, how much is good enough? Is 95% good enough? Is 97%? We're not going to have 100% here, but we've got to figure out how we start moving the whole system. Anything that segregates product as good and bad, where the bad still has the biggest market, is charging a premium for something where the producers are already better. We need to be using premiums to fix the bottom.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you're looking at the commodity markets, as soon as you put that crop into the elevator or into the silo, it's
Right.
all
It's
mixed up
mixed.
together. And that means, our infrastructure is very much focused on that average value. When you look at the wine industries, one that will I think, highlight some of this, because you can walk into a wine shop and you'll find bottles for, $10, and you'll find bottles for $1,000 or more. And at the end of the day, it's all fermented grape juice. So it's basically the same stuff, but because there's that, link to how it's grown, and, the wine industry has done a great job in telling those stories and creating those variations in value. But
Right.
that links all the way back to the producer, but it's not all dumped into one big vat and mixed together. So you can.
Let me take that example though, and just put it back at you. So how many of the great vineyards with the terroir known in France are even going to be producing palatable red wine in the future? I mean, we're going to have to figure out how to address this issue, because we need traceability and transparency, not just for a bottle price, but for a system sustainability.
Scottish wine.
Well, England has, and Belgium, and I think even Scandinavia is starting to win some awards in wine.
So thank you very much for that. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
I think I feel like I've been rode hard and running out wet. I think you got about everything you're going to get from me.
Wonderful, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Jason Clay. Please subscribe to the Ash Cloud if you've enjoyed this podcast, to listen to further discussions on food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political and cultural challenges facing our society, and creative ideas on how to address them.